again, we received. We're doing this in response to our Tru Fire community and some questions they've had. Sorry, I had to stop there because I had forgotten to push the record button, so I wanted to make sure that we're recording here. The webinar we'll unpack today, we're going to look at just kind of the overview of the vision of Remember and Celebrate Weekends. What's the purpose? Why is it so important? Why did we include it in our curriculum? And then we also want to talk about the components of a Remember and Celebrate lesson. How similar or how different is it to a regular lesson? And then we'll end today with a Q&A. We realize that there might be some really detailed questions, so John and I would be happy to spend an additional 10 minutes answering questions, and then John will also be available to answer questions as well. Okay, so when we're looking at our Remember and Celebrate lessons, and we have, before we kind of jump into the nuts and bolts of it, I want you to know that our focus today is really on Tru Fire story. But all of our age levels, whether you're working with blessings, wonder, story, or identity, they're all very similar in that they are going to pause and do what we call a Remember and Celebrate weekend. Now, when you're looking at blessings and you're looking at identity here, those are very similar in that they only do a Remember and Celebrate lesson at the end of their quarter or unit. So when you're looking at blessings, blessings is going to do a Remember and Celebrate at the very end, that 13th lesson. And again, it's going to focus on that foundational truth that they have been learning that entire quarter. When you look at identity, identity is broken up into 8 to 10 week units. And so identity will have a Remember and Celebrate lesson also at the end as well. Wonder and story are very similar to each other. And you'll see here, because on the 6th and 13th week of the scope and sequence for every quarter, we have one of these weekends. Now, I will tell you that the components for the story and the wonder do look different. So our focus today is to unpack what a Tru Fire story, Remember and Celebrate lesson would look like. If you have questions about wonder, you'll want to contact John or myself, or we have a few more community members that can help you with that as well. So again, while story and wonder are the same in terms of reviewing the Remember and Celebrate on week 16 and 13, and also the feast is exactly the same as well. It's a little bit different in the components. So I'm going to turn it over to John here. He's going to really kind of unpack for you the vision for Remember and Celebrate lessons, and then dive into what a Remember and Celebration lesson will actually look like.
Okay, so the vision really behind Remember and Celebrate is kind of unique, and it's not really seen in a lot of other curriculums. The idea is that basically in the Old Testament, we see the Jewish people being called to these feasts and these festivals by God. And the whole point of those feasts and festivals was basically that they would take time to remember and celebrate specific things of who God is. They were going to look back on the faithfulness of God. They were going to look back at the provision of God. They were going to look back at these wonderful things that God had done for them. And really in focusing on that, on who God is. And so a part of that is that the Jewish people weren't just called to just remember, but they were called to take time out of their schedule, often to go on some kind of pilgrimage or trip, but to do things differently. Basically, they were going to stop and they were going to remember the things that God had done. And so in a similar way, we really want to challenge our kids. Hey, in the busyness of life, even though so much is going on, God calls us to take rest, to stop, to break from the norms of life, from the busyness of life, and just remember and celebrate the things that he's done in their life. I don't know about you, but in our church life, I often find with my church that we do a big event and then the next day we're on to the next event. We rarely often in our culture remember to stop and celebrate the things that God has done. And that's really the idea behind this, is that you can see the different feasts listed here. The idea is that just like those feasts, we're going to encourage kids, hey, God wants us to stop, remember the things that he's done, and celebrate those things. And so twice a quarter, we're going to do that. And sometimes it seems like a lot, but it's really building in those disciplines into kids' lives so that they would really appreciate the things that God's done for them. And so that they would grow up knowing the testimonies that they've got and the things that God's done for them, so they can share them with others. And so that's kind of a little bit of the vision for that.
So
And
John,
hopefully that's kind of,
so John,
yes.
talk to us now as we kind of move on. Talk to us about really just the components of the lesson. We know that in most lessons we have explore, discover, respond, and bless. So
Yes.
how is a remember and celebrate similar, and how is it different than a regular lesson?
Yeah, so I think some people are kind of overwhelmed by Remember and Celebrate weeks. They're different from the regular lessons. But actually, as you look at this structure, you notice they're not that different. You know, really, kids aren't going to feel the difference too much, because we still have that explore at the start and we still have that bless at the end. So there are familiar elements. But what we do have is these different sections of Remember and Celebrate, and we'll go through those in detail now. But just know that we do encourage people when they're starting out with the curriculum, maybe in that first quarter, maybe the first time, that first lesson 6, maybe you don't want to do Remember and Celebrate week. Maybe it's too soon. Maybe you want to get your volunteers into the flow of doing regular lessons first. But we really do encourage you to jump into Remember and Celebrate weekends as soon as you've kind of found your grounding and your feet. So we'll look at Remember and basically take a bit of a closer look at that. So, well, explore, we can just show explore really quick, but explore basically, again, it's just like every other week. We're trying to pique the curiosity of the kids. We're basically trying to help them understand a little bit about what's going to happen that day. And in particular with explore, we really want to help kids get the idea of what the feast is that we're going to be covering this particular Remember and Celebrate. Every Remember and Celebrate, we're going to highlight a different one of the feasts, one of the Jewish feasts. We're not going to go into huge detail about them, but we're just going to shed some light on those feasts, and we're going to shed some light on what those feasts tell us about who God is. So explore is just a way to kind of get the kids' curiosity going. It's a small group activity at the start, and then we jump straight into Remember.
And the explore activity, John, is very similar to just a regular lesson. Again, it's just an activity to build that excitement for younger and older kids. Not really much different, correct?
Yes. And so you go from that small group environment like you would every week, or as an open activity with free play. And then you start your large group, and your large group really starts with Remember. Again, Remember is not totally different from what we have previously, because you still have traditions and you still have the Remember verse. Sometimes you'll be reviewing the Remember verse just one. Sometimes you'll be reviewing 2 Remember verses, or you could even remember all 3 from the whole quarter. And again, those are just reviewing what they've already learned. You're trying to remember the things that we've covered in the past. The next element to remember is actually this idea of teaching the kids something simple about the feast or the celebration that we're talking about that day, the Jewish feast or festival. So this month or this week, it would be the Feast of the First Fruits. And the idea is you're going to give that relate section. That's kind of the miniature teaching. Sometimes it's a little bit longer than that. Sometimes it's shorter. That's going to really cover the element of who God is that the feast conveys. And then you've got some follow-up questions there for the kids to kind of go over with the kids. So that section is kind of small.
Yeah, and I kind of think of that as like a mini lesson, so to speak. So in our regular lessons, we have the Big God story, which is a very large storytelling, so to speak, and it's, again, going over the character of God. And as John said, when you're looking at your feast and festival, it's kind of like a mini lesson right there. And again, we're kind of unpacking for kids, what do we know about God through the feast of the first fruits or the Passover. So again, this is something that some churches just want to focus on what they've already learned about God in previous weeks. And some churches may not really dive too deep into the feasts and festivals, but know that they are there and know that that's like a mini lesson for you.
And again, we're really not trying to say to people, hey, you've got to celebrate these feasts. We're not trying to encourage that, but we're really trying to say, hey, children, there's a discipline here. There's a value in understanding this. And there's still things that we can get from it now. So that's the element about the feast. And really, it's not a very large element, but it is interesting for kids, and it's interesting for adults too, I feel. The next element to this is a rather significant element. It's the remember and play. And most of us know this as the Zonk game. So this is basically, really simply put, it's a review game that basically reviews the past weeks of teaching, the past 6 to 12 weeks of teaching. You get 10 questions to ask the kids. Often churches will write their own questions and add them in as well. Really depends how much time you want to allot to it. It's got a full set of instructions in the how it works document, and I can explain it in a little bit, but really that's probably the best place to go and look at. It's a pretty simple review game, and all I would say to you is if you find that your ministry after a couple of months or a year gets bored of doing Zonk, then we really encourage you to think of other review games. One of the review games that I think of is we do paper cups and plates, and when kids get a question right, their team gets to put down a paper cup and a paper plate, and the kids make a tower, and the tallest tower wins. We use wet heads, which is a roulette game with water. We use pie face, and we basically make sure that this element is a really fun element. It's not all about just memorization, but it's about seeing that kids are catching the things that we're teaching, that they're falling in love with the stories. And so I encourage you to really read up on Zonk. Some of the instructions can seem overwhelming. Some people like to really simplify that. It has some challenge cards in there. It has ways for kids and teams to build up points and compete together. And it's really a fun time. But again, don't be overwhelmed by that. You could do a simple quiz with points. It doesn't have to be crazy intense like that, but it's a lot of fun. So you should check out the instructions.
I agree. That's well said, John. I think the main point here is that you're just having fun reviewing what you've learned about who God is and some of the characters in the Bible. And just know that there are some really great question and answer slides, as you can kind of see there. So we've provided those for you as well. So just kind of to go back over then, when you're looking at Remember, you're really doing your traditions and your Remember verse here. And then you're unpacking very quickly one of the feasts or festivals, and then you're doing a review game. So a mini lesson and a review game. And then part of review, that review component is completed. And then next we move to Celebrate. John, talk to us about the Celebrate section.
Yeah, so we've done the Remember element. This is now kind of celebrating. This is kind of maybe more of the spiritual element, if you like. We've kind of remembered the memorization element, if you like, a little bit. Now this is a bit more celebration. And so there's a number of different pieces. And again, when you look at Remember, it's quite a full segment. When you look at Celebrate, it's quite a full segment. They're not saying do everything. They're saying, hey, pick and choose, a bit like kind of a buffet or, you know, a platter. You take in little bits, and some weeks you'll do all of a section, other weeks you'll just do little bits. And so you'll see with Celebrate, it's broken down into some main compartments. The first one is my experience with God. You can't see very clearly, but basically my experience with God is basically that we're gonna look back at the past six weeks, and we're really gonna focus on the response stations and the respond times. So what I mean by that is we're gonna look at the things that kids wrote down on cards on the response stations. We're going to maybe bring out some of those response stations for kids to see, to kind of jog their memory. We're also maybe going to bring out some of the respond things that kids have made in their small groups that they've collectively done. And then we're going to pick a couple. I would say pick a few. Don't say, okay, we're going to go through every single one and every child's going to say something. Pick out some of the ones where you look back yourself and think, man, that week, that was really powerful for us. Oh, week 3, that was powerful. Oh, week 4, that didn't really hit home, so we're not going to cover that one. But week 3 and week 5, they're the ones we're going to. And I would pick some of those and kind of look at the questions they're offering to ask kids. And really, it's just trying to ask them, hey, what were those experiences like? What have you seen of God's presence in your life? What have you seen of God's provision? And of the different weeks, it's going to highlight different questions to ask them, to kind of get them to think and remember. And again, to start to celebrate the things that God's done through their life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, so that's the first element. And then the second element is this storytelling element. So the first segment is maybe them sharing their heart and what's been going on in their life in terms of just how it's relating to God. The second element might be more of storytelling, where really I'm thinking more testimonies. So this is a great opportunity for us as leaders to bring people into our ministries who are going to influence our kids, who are going to share their stories of faith and inspire our kids. And so they could be random people in our church who we've seen, who we know have close and intimate relationships with God. They could be people that we know who have seen God's provision or God's protection or God's healing. And we're just going to invite those people into our space for storytelling, to share their stories, to share testimonies. I think that's a dying thing in the church today. When I grew up, on Sunday mornings, we would have a regular service, but Sunday night, man, every Sunday night almost, I remember people getting up and sharing testimonies. And it's left a strong impression on my heart because I've seen of the goodness of God. I've heard these stories of people who have had God move in their life in such profound ways. And I think we need to bring that into our kids' ministries, because what this does is when they see other people sharing their faith, soon in storytelling, you'll have kids who put their hand up and want to share their stories. And that's what it's all about. There's times where you'll maybe bring people in, and there's times where you'll say, hey, we've got an open mic. I want you to share about some of the things that God's doing in your heart, something that God's doing in your life, maybe in your family's life. And then on top of that, this is a great time to invite a missionary in. This is a great time to share BGMC clips because, again, it's sharing about the good things that God's doing. When we do remember and celebrate, it's not just about remembering and celebrating what God's doing in our lives, but it's also about remembering and celebrating what God's doing around the world and in other people's lives. And so I really appreciate storytelling because it's that great opportunity for intergenerational just sharing, So the last section of Celebrate is then celebrating together. And there's 3 elements to this. It's a little bit more fun, and so the first element is breaking bread. This is just really, essentially, it's like snack time. I mean, kids are this can be done in large group, it can be done in small group. It's meant for large group, but the idea is you would have some kind of food maybe that relates to the feast. It could be some kind of snack that is easy for you to prepare, or it doesn't have to be anything special, but it's just the idea of kids are going to eat together. And as they do, they're going to share and they're going to talk. The second element to that is music. Again, it's just celebrating. Kids are going to dance. It's going to be upbeat music, going to be lively. This is a great opportunity if you are focusing on missions and BGMC. This is a great time to kind of put on some maybe music from different cultures and celebrate, lively music and different things like that. And then the last element, this is response. It's a response statement, a response station, and it's called a celebration station. They do give you other responses each week, but there's also one in the How It Works document called a response station, or called a celebration station, where you can write down on rocks something that God's been for you that week, or these past 6 weeks. So those are kind of the basic elements of Celebrate. Again, there's a lot there, and we don't necessarily say, hey, do everything. We say pick and choose, figure out what's going to work for you guys. The main elements of Celebrate, I would probably say, are my experience with God and storytelling. Just because, again, it's getting the idea of testimony and getting kids to start talking. Because really, that's when we test and see really whether things have worked. If we do all the talking all the time, we don't really know if kids are catching it. We only know when they are able to process, they're taking it from their head to their heart, and God's been able to work, and then they're willing to share the things that God's done.
That's good. So again, and then if we move on to the last component, which is bless, I'm assuming this is fairly, and I'm asking this as a question to you. I know the answer, but just so that everyone else knows, unpack for us, John, the bless section. And is this really very different from a regular lesson, or is this traditionally about the same?
No, this is exactly the same. It's kind of it's very similar to what we have every other week. We really encourage people, hey, if you don't have time in a regular lesson to do bless, maybe take time in the remember and celebrate time. It is really worthwhile because again, we're speaking life into kids, we're encouraging them, and like I say, this is pretty much the same thing as what we do in other weeks.
Sure. Well, with that said, we've kind of just wanted to give you a brief overview of what a Remember and Celebrate lesson might look like and the components of it. If you're interested in diving a little bit deeper and you want to know more information about it, on our website under the resource tab, there is a section called How It Works, and you can actually download both versions of our How It Works document. So let me explain what that is. First of all, we have for Wonder, which is our preschool, and also our elementary, a How It Works specifically dedicated to Remember and Celebrate weekends. So that unpacks for you exactly all the components and what that would look like. And remember, we mentioned that Wonders, Remember and Celebrate, look a little different than Story, which is our elementary version. And then there is also, when you download that How It Works document, there's actually an additional How It Works doc, and that's just for a regular lesson. So you'll just see it says components of a Tru Fire Wonder large group, small group program. So that, again, that's just your regular lesson. So keep in mind when you're downloading both of these that there are two different, obviously, age levels, and then there are two different documents, one for regular lesson and one for How It Works. A lot of people ask us about the feast and festivals, the 7 of them. In the How It Works document, in both the Wonder and the Story How It Works doc, you'll see that there's a listing of really the significance of the feasts and festivals in the Old Testament and New Testament, and then also kind of shares each one of those feasts and festivals, and then gives a short summary of what those are as well. So let's go ahead, and if you have questions, I'll give you a few minutes to type up your question and send that in. While you're typing it in, we wanted to make you aware of a few things. On our website, on that very first page, if you ever need to talk to a community leader, there's a section called Got Questions, and you can schedule a time to chat with John or with Nina or any one of our other Tru Fire community leaders. We also have a really great Facebook group that we love hearing and allowing people to really share their thoughts, get help, share ideas. So if you haven't, we'd love for you to join the conversation at our Facebook group. And then we also wanted to let you know that we have some product, brand new Tru Fire product. We have our Blessings t-shirt, Have You Blessed Your Kids Today, which I absolutely love. It has the Tru Fire logo on the back. So if you were looking for ways to bless your team during the holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas, this might be an option. We also have our tumblers and our buttons as well. And if you use our promo code TRU Fire FB, like Facebook, you'll get a 20% off on that order. All right, so give me a second here, and I'm going to look through our questions. Awesome. So one person just says, thank you. I've downloaded the How It Works document. They're very helpful. Great resources. Another person saying the Facebook group is great. Love sharing ideas and problem solving. Another person saying, here's a question. We're starting Tru Fire Story in January of 2018. Should we wait until the second week, lesson 7, the second weekend, lesson 7, as opposed to start with a remember and celebrate? In order to be on track with the dated sequence, should we wait until January 14th?
What
Um,
I would just say to that would be, it's really up to you. If you didn't want to do the first two Remember and Celebrates in January and February, I think it's January, February, January, March, you could start on lesson 4, and then you do lesson 4, lesson 5, skip lesson 6, do 7 through 12, and then start the next quarter. Does that make sense?
mhm.
So you could when you buy that quarter for January, you could just start a couple of lessons earlier to avoid for that confusion of doing remember and celebrate. Does that make sense? Yeah.
That makes sense to me. Steve Davis, he's the one who answered or asked that question. So, Steve, if John didn't quite answer your question, you're welcome to reach out to him and he can help you with that. Let's see. Someone else says, on any given Sunday, are we supposed to have multiple response stations up? This is Sadie Smith. Sadie, this is a really great question. We've had a lot of people ask about response stations. So, John, it says, on any given Sunday, are we supposed to have multiple response stations up? So I think she's talking about,
I would say, yeah, I
yeah,
would say for that, I think it's really based on where you're at as a ministry. Some people just like to start out doing one response station that's given in the curriculum, and then others will say periodically or twice a month or once a month or maybe every week. It depends on where your kids are at. They'll open up other stations. In fact, I know of a church in Roscoe, Illinois, with Heather Marble, and she will open up for Remember and Celebrate. She'll make that as a prayer response or a prayer experience, and that will be part of what she does for Remember and Celebrate. And so, Remember and Celebrate is actually a good time to maybe start experimenting with other stations and maybe doing 5 or 6 stations around because the kids are used to a different service. But otherwise, yeah, feel free. Start thinking about what are the different things with every service. So maybe you want a thankful station. Maybe you want a prayer wall. Maybe you want prayer journals. One of the things that we do is we have a little letter box and we'll do letters to God. And kids will come and they'll write down their letters. And the more different outlets you give, it allows kids to really sense where the Holy Spirit is leading them. Hey, is God putting on my heart to pray for countries around the world, or is he putting on my heart to share a prayer request? I think that's a part of these response stations, helping kids really sense what the Holy Spirit is doing in their heart. I always say one lesson can speak to one child in 100 different ways. We could have a group of kids and they hear the story of Jonah. One of them's called to be a missionary and another one is called to confess their sins. The problem when we just have one response station is that only necessarily sometimes restricts kids to respond in one way.
that's good. There's Nina Durning is actually on our webinar today, and she's one of our Tru Fire community leaders. She said, you could also do a BGMC lesson if you are not comfortable with doing a remember and celebrate right off the bat. And I think that's a great suggestion. I typically recommend to folks who are just getting into Tru Fire to hold off on the remember and celebrate lessons. So that would be a great option to do BGMC. If you're not familiar with BGMC, it's Boys and Girls Missionary Challenge. And that is our children's ministry missions arm here at the Assemblies of God. We have another question, John. It says, what does a typical lesson look like time-wise? So how long, and I'm assuming this person's specifically asking about the remember and celebrate. So what have you experienced, John, as you kind of go through the remember and celebrate weekend?
Well, like you say, typically the explore is going to be 10 minutes like usual. So I mean, it's not that much different, but again, it really just depends. I think if you're trying to do everything, it's probably too overwhelming. I have a service of I used to have a service of an hour. Now we have an hour and 10 minutes. And so even with that, we have to be cautious because we're still putting in our times of worship. where we're singing songs and doing slower songs as well. So it is a little bit different for everybody, but Explore, you're looking about 10 minutes. Bless, it's usually only about 5 minutes. And so in between, they recommend that about 20 minutes for Remember. Sorry, probably about 30 minutes for Remember, about 15, 20 minutes for Celebrate. But I think with all the different elements, I think you could easily do, I think really you could easily do 25, 30 minutes for Remember and easily do 30 minutes for Celebrate as well. So it really just depends on what you want to fit in there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes good sense. Let me ask you this, John, and then because it looks like we've got one more question. If you had limited time, what do you feel, in your opinion, or what has worked best in your ministry of the components of the Remember and Celebrate lesson? So if there were some that you just had to do and you wouldn't pass by every Remember and Celebrate and you had limited time, what would those components be? Would you focus on Celebrate? Would you do the review game? So I'm just kind of curious as to what you would focus on.
I think the main elements that I probably see are probably more. I think teaching the festival is a great thing because even though it's only short, it doesn't take up much time, but it's adding some value to the kids. It is teaching them something that day. I think that's a great thing. I think the Zonk game or some kind of review game is always fun. Brings in a different element that maybe we don't see every single week in Tru Fire. And so it's a really fun thing for the kids to kind of engage with. And then I think, just like we said before, I think my experience with God, even if you just select a couple of those elements of weeks to discuss, and then storytelling, those two are really powerful. And then that celebration station as well is well worth doing. So if you can only do so much large group stuff in the middle, and again, take a look at that. Maybe some of those elements can definitely be done in small group. They don't have to be all done in a large group. Sometimes it's better to break off, for my experience with God, and have kids in smaller groups because they're more willing to share. Same with storytelling. It's easier for kids to tell their story maybe to begin with to smaller groups. So yeah, I think those are probably the key components.
Awesome. I think that's it. The only other last question someone asked is, what does NLRC stand for? And NLRC stands for the National Leadership and Resource Center, which is the Assemblies of God National Office here in Springfield, Missouri. Hey, folks, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. If you have more specific questions and you want to connect with one of our community leaders, we encourage you to go ahead and email John Hales at jhales@myhealthychurch.com. Or go ahead and get on our website, jump on our Facebook page, or schedule something on our website there. Hope you have a great day, and hope to see you or actually have you join us on a few webinars in the future. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.